Welcome everyone to this latest incarnation of SEPAD Discusses. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by Marc Owen Jones, who is going to be talking about this wonderful book here, Political Repression in Bahrain. And as if by magic, you host up your own. And also the wonderful Statci Strobel, who will be acting as a discussant of Marc's book, and offering a bit of context and helping us work through some of the many rich and wonderful, fascinating, stimulating, evocative ideas that are contained within. I will do a very quick introduction to Marc and Statci. I'm sure many of you know who they are, but Marc is Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. He holds a PhD from Durham, where he wrote an interdisciplinary thesis on the history of political repression in Bahrain that is now out in book form with Cambridge University Press. So I'm delighted to welcome Marc to our session today. And of course, Statci is Assistant Dean and Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. She's the author of the absolutely wonderful Sectarian Order in Bahrain, The Social and Colonial Origins of Criminal Justice, that was published by Lexington Books 2 years ago, which feels like a long, long time ago right now, Statci, I imagine. But I think it's absolutely wonderful. We've got Statci here today. Stacey's done some of the most stimulating work on Bahrain that I've come across, present company excluded, of course, Marc. And I agree. It'd be great to have a conversation that brings them both together. I should start by saying that although we're talking about Bahrain, there is a distinct lack of a Bahraini presence on this panel today. And that, I think, is important to acknowledge. And it's important to acknowledge and stress that we tried to find a Bahraini willing to come and talk about Marc's work. There were many who wanted to, many who've engaged privately with Marc and with others about it and have found it rich, stimulating, helpful, and incredibly insightful. But I guess the very fact that a number of people were unwilling to engage in a public forum about questions like this tell us a great deal about why the book is even necessary. It tells a great deal about some of the broader contextual factors that Marc is trying to explore in the book. So I wanted to just acknowledge that right at the start, that although this is a book about Bahrain, we sought to have representatives from Bahrain or Bahrainis who could come and talk about some of the things that were going on in the book. But unfortunately, due to, well, I guess the political, social contexts within which many of them are living and working, either directly or at a distance, it proved a little bit too sensitive, unfortunately. So I guess we'll have to make do with our wonderful panel of Marc and Statci, which I think is excellent, and I'm really looking forward to this today. So without further ado then, let's have a chat about this wonderful book. So Marc, can you tell us a little bit to kick off? What were you trying to do with the book? Why did you engage in I guess what was essentially a PhD thesis on political repression in Bahrain? What are you trying to do for anyone who's not read the book just yet, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. And it's great to be here with you and Statci. I remember one of Stacey's essays on policing in Bahrain was very kind of inspirational for me at the beginning of my PhD. So it's really great to actually meet face to face, Zoom to Zoom, however you want to call it. But yeah, I mean, just actually your question also touches on some, I suppose, of the positionality that I want to talk about, which relates to also what you said about having no Bahraini here. I mean, I think it's important to qualify that while I consider myself Bahraini in the sense that I grew up there, you know, I think part of me writing, and I think we need to complicate the notion of who belonging versus citizenship and that kind of thing, because I'm obviously not a Bahraini citizen. And I have the privilege of, I say the relative privilege in the case of writing about Bahrain, having a British passport, you know, being a white male and that kind of thing. And, you know, it was a very difficult decision for me because Bahrain was my home. And obviously when I made the decision to write about political repression in Bahrain, that evolved out of starting my PhD in 2011 when the Arab uprising started, I knew very soon that if I continued to write, I'd be no longer welcome. So I was taking a personal risk, but at the same time, I wasn't taking the type of risks that many of the people I'm writing about were taking, because for them, they had no other form of privilege, a passport privilege or otherwise. You know, for them, they lived in Bahrain, they had, you know, for them to actually put their bodies on the line and express, you know, dissent was a life or death issue. So I can't compare it in that regard. But certainly I feel like I belong to the place. But the notion of political repression in Bahrain became clearer when I started my PhD, which initially had been on social media. I was interested in social media. And in 2011, it was very much a discussion about the liberation technology, the emancipatory potential of social media. And I became aware quite quickly whilst immersing myself in what I called like what is called a virtual ethnography, that social media was being used very much as a tool of control, surveillance, intimidation, repression. And I found that very interesting, and I began to write about that, and that got me looking more into the repression literature, which is a rich body of literature. You know, I think a couple of people have commented to me, well, the name of the book itself sounds somehow political, or as an activist. I'm not going to get now into the nebulous distinction, I think, between academic and activist, but political repression it's a perfectly valid inquiry within political science or social science. And I thought, well, I'm looking at political repression. I'm looking at the multiple facets of political repression, which span the media, which span the police force, which span the structure of the state or the institutions of the state itself. And I thought, you know, when I found out that I was banned from going back to Bahrain in 2012, and I couldn't necessarily do research in Bahrain itself, that would have allowed me to have done methodologically somewhat a different approach, such as interviews or an ethnography on the ground. I decided that, you know, it would be useful to use my position as someone, again, who's a British citizen, to access the archives and sort of root around in them, or and explore the history of Bahrain, which has been done before, including by Statci, but others as Fouad Khoury and Rumeyhi, you know, Emil Nakhla. There's plenty about Abdul Hadi Khalaf. They've all looked at history, but obviously history is always narrated through a particular lens. And I thought, well, what will the literature on repression, what lens will that create? And therefore, what will it allow me to focus on? What will come to the surface as I go through these documents with these, you know, theories, themes, and concepts of repression through my mind? And that's really what I began to look at. And the reason I sort of decided to go back to the 1920s, which is where the book broadly begins, is because, you know, I say becoming part of the uprising in the sense that I became, quote unquote, an activist. You know, I became very familiar very quickly as someone studying the Bahrain, but also studying its history, that, you know, there was sequences of uprisings in Bahrain. It was an anomaly or an outlier in the Gulf sense. Not entirely, I don't want to essentialize, but it had a very kind of rich history of attempted trade union activism, anti-imperial kind of resistance. And I thought that was fascinating in itself. So I thought, well, we got these different elements of unrest every decade or so. And although they succeeded in enabling some reforms, they never fundamentally, I would say, dramatically altered the system of power or the Al Khalifa's dominance of control over Bahrain. And I thought, why is that so? Even with the democratic experience, I thought people are protesting despite the facade democracy in Bahrain. So there must be a reason for those things. And I thought political repression was the appropriate way to look at the way in which the Al Khalifa regime, as opposed from the state necessarily, prevented challenges to their power. I thought that was an important question to explore, which has been explored in different ways, don't get me wrong, but political repression was just a slightly different, umbrella of theories and concepts with which to look at it through.
Sure. That's really interesting to hear you say, Mark, and particularly that distinction between the Al Khalifa and the state, particularly on such a small archipelago, if you will. To talk about that subtle distinction seems so very important, yet somewhat I don't want to say problematic, but counterintuitive, perhaps, given the sheer size of all of this and what's going on. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the main argument of the book, please, for people who've not read it yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, broadly speaking, the book asks the question, how have the Al Khalifa regime repressed dissent since the 1920s? And I position that within this notion that Bahrain's an interesting case study because it was a place in which imperial overrule by the British dominated for hundreds of years. And Bahrain then attained independence in the 1970s. So I thought it would be an interesting, in a way, comparative study between what it was like between, say, the 1920s and independence in 1971, beyond that. So there was already this kind of comparative element. And then what I ended up arguing is that obviously repression depends on circumstances. It depends on the resources available to the regime, but it also depends, in Bahrain's case, on the fact Bahrain is a small state and that it's very much subject to the kind of the kind of overrule of protecting powers, whether that was Britain or, for example, Saudi Arabia in the US. And I think there's an exceptional argument to be made that Bahrain is very much, the nature of repression, from whether torture is used to whether people are executed, can often depend on a political shift elsewhere. And I also make the argument that the dynamics between the, let's say, the suzerain, in the first case, the British, and then I would argue to an extent the Saudis informally, also impacted on the nature of the repression occurring. And that the modalities of repression changed between the 1920s and 1971, beyond 1971, to the present day. That's not to, and this is I need to be very clear on this, that's not to say one repression is better than the other or lighter than the other. It's just to say that the nature of repression changes and people can draw their own conclusions whether they think there ought to be a better way to do things. I don't think that's a necessarily useful road to go down. But yeah, I would say, if we talk about the trajectory of repression now, the amount of people killed, tortured, executed in Bahrain since the 70s has progressively got worse since that. And it very much echoes, I think, what happened leading up to the 1920s, which was, very much arbitrary violence extracted against the indigenous Bahana population by the ruling regime. There was a lull in the nature of that violence, I would say, between the 1920s and 1971. However, what happened between 1920 and 1971 was very important in solidifying and ossifying the structures of power, the Al Khalifa regime, that would then enable the current situation of repressive methods which are incredibly violent to continue. So that's kind of my main argument. It's always very hard to sum up the argument of an entire book, but I would say if I want to sum this up in one sentence, repression changes depending on the suzerainty, and it's very much changed over the past 100 years or so. The modalities have changed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it's a really rich book and a really fascinating forensic analysis of what's going on. And what you've just articulated there was one of my main takeaways, that while seemingly very obvious, there are obviously a whole host of different contingent factors that are shaping the behavior of particular actors: time, space, socioeconomic, geopolitical, etc., etc. And I find it absolutely fascinating, deeply depressing, of course, but absolutely fascinating.
Hope is not. Hope is unfortunately not an outcome of this book. Reflecting my own cynicism, I suppose. But I blame the past 10 years for making more cynical than I already was.
Yeah.
Well, I just was writing down modalities of repression, and I made a Freudian slip and wrote modalities of depression based on what Marc said. So I think I'm on the same page there, that it's a bleak picture.
Yeah, that's my past 10 years, Statci. Modalities of depression have very much shifted. Either better or worse, but they definitely changed.
Well, Statci, why don't you tell us a little bit about your reflections on the book, please? For anyone who doesn't know, Statci's written this absolutely wonderful book that focuses predominantly on that 1920s period, although Statci has written wonderful material on the more recent past, but your book focuses on the 20s. So what was your takeaway having read Marc's book?
First of all, I think it's an absolutely excellent work. I mean, I can't say how excited I am about this line of inquiry. And for me, it was a really big relief to see this in print, because the critical scholarship on Bahrain has been underdeveloped. It's now getting a lot better in the last 10 years. This seems to be a place, sort of a one-stop shopping for gathering up. So empirically, this is really important, because it gathers up the kind of data and information that has been hidden in some cases, or obscured in some cases, but just underdeveloped in general in English in English writing scholarship on Bahrain. So for that, I thank you. I mean, this is a lot of hard work. And I would be really interested in sort of how you wrangled, you mentioned in your talk just now that you were unable to do the interviews and the ethnographic kind of data collection that you might have done otherwise, if not banned from being in the country. But that being said, from looking at all your resources, you took a wide archival look. You had this huge time span of 100 years. So this is really a gargantuan work, and I think it represents years of study. I really like that you used repression as an analytical tool. I think it allowed you to get at, as you mentioned, the ethical and social justice issues in a way that wasn't just some sort of activist judgment, or, it actually put it in a frame, and it got us thinking about, and I'm using your words here, that many have suffered as a result of this kind of repression. And so it put that human element, I think, back into the analysis in a way that some scholarship has not been able to do. And so really appreciated that. And also your sensitivity to the internal and the external factors, which I found really difficult in looking at just the short time period that I did, to sort of, because the internal and the external are really blurred in Bahrain because of the tribal alliances, the Saudi-Iranian influence, at different times, the colonial experience as well. And so I think you really added that element skillfully in a way that I would probably be critical of my own work that didn't maybe do as good of a job as that. I really like that you were looking at the Al Khalifa as the dominant sort of mode of the state. I mean, we really don't understand the state without the Khalifa, and actually there isn't much of a state outside of it, would be my argument, right? So that was, and that's part of the problem, is that we have a sort of royal family and a tribe, if you will, that is sort of taken over a nation state and over the years, despite all these other influences that might have led it on a different path. So excellent. One of the things that I think was really important that I saw in the archives when I was looking at the archives from the 1920s, 1930s, but wasn't able to get to, was the following the money of the privy purse in the colonial sort of high colonial times after the Orders in Council in 1919. And you did a really good job of showing how power was changing based on how the flow of state money and the civil list occurred. I think that was really important for understanding the kinds of shifts in power, and then how that also didn't maybe go as far as the British may have liked, because it created an opportunity for the Al Khalifa to usurp that and use it to their own advantage. And so following the money there, I thought was really good. What I focused on mostly in looking at your book, of course, was the legal repression stuff, because I know that the most.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I really appreciated the conflict criminological perspective, and that you looked at law as a means of social control. Charles Tilly is one of my favorites. You brought that in. That was great. Foucault got in there with the quadrillage and looking at policing positioned in a certain way. And then even the focus on the extra legal. And that's something I've also found, and I think you handled that really well, which is when you have this tribe and this family, who is the state and who's acting on behalf of the state, who's a vigilante, what's legal, what's extra legal. I think it all gets blurred and really quickly. And so I really appreciated that you waded through some of those nuances and sort of showed how loyalists end up doing the bidding of the state in very violent ways. And so are they actually the state, an arm of the state on some level, right? And so sort of dealing with some of that. I just had a couple questions, mostly about the legal repression stuff, and because I don't want to talk too much, I want to give you a chance to say more.
No, sure. This is great. I mean, this was my, you know, when I knew you'd be here, I'd be like, Stacey's gonna take me to task on the legal repression.
No. These are good questions. I sort of was wondering. So, you characterize the British colonial experience in Bahrain as implementing a middle way. And so I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, maybe this is just for my own benefit, sorry, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit more about how you see the colonial history, because in most histories of Bahrain, we talk about indirect rule. And then I'm sure, very familiar with James Onley's work, where he says actually it was called indirect rule, but it was actually a full colonial project after the Orders in Council. And I'm just wondering, if you come down on that in a certain way, do you see Bahrain as a full colonial state in a way that maybe continues to need to be revised in the history? So that was one question. Was this a deep administrative takeover by the British, or were they more indirect in mediating, and sort of how did you see that in looking at the records? Because I think there's controversy about that, and I think we're wrestling with that now in terms of writing that history. That was the first question I had. Another question I had, which is probably a question that is really apropos for SEPAD folks, is one of the things that I would want to hear more about is who the target of the Al Khalifa repression is over time. So you say that it's dynamic, that it's shifting and changing. It's clear that you're focusing rightly, I think, on Al Khalifa hegemony as really dictating who's in and out from a regime point of view. You rightly show that early on at the point of conquest, the Baharna were the downtrodden and oppressed and even enslaved. You also mentioned that maybe later on the distinction that might have been more identity-wise more about the repression would be Arab versus Persian. You know, there's this moment in the 1920s where the Baharna are potentially protected by the British, but that's short-lived. You do that really well. That's a big detail that I think is really important to understand. But then you also talk about sectarianism and Shia identity, which is a larger identity that cross-cuts some of these other ones. So my question was, do you have a sort of particular theory about sort of who is targeted and why? How much does sectarianism matter? How much do these other identities matter? I'd be really interested in your take on that. And you do mention, I think rightly so, that the Baharna, that indigenous Bahraini population, there's a particular antipathy there. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that. I found the same thing. And so how is the oppression of that group different maybe than other groups? Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
No, that's great.
Can I break those down a little bit, Stacey, please?
Yes, do. Yeah.
I think there's so many interesting points there that I jotted down in sort of a bit of a flow in terms of what's going on in the many different layers and narratives in the book, Mark. But I wonder, just because there may be some people with us who've not read the book, could you just say a little bit about the archive material that you got access to, please? And then if you could maybe flag up that the first question that Stacey raised about colonialism and Bahrain.
And the middle way.
Yeah. And then we can get onto the sectarianism, Baharna conquest targets and whatnot shortly, if that's okay.
It's fine with me. I mean, they will overlap anyway, so
of course,
you know. But yeah, so archivally, I mean, to be fair, you know, research is messy, as they say, right? And obviously, when you force yourself to say, "What's your method?" You know, you're like, "Well, I did archival stuff, and I did." You know, an important aspect to bear in mind with the book is that it does. There are multiple methods at play. You know, for example, I incorporate the virtual ethnography I did online with content analysis. There's an element of open source research. I did a lot of documentation of police violence during the uprising. I also was part of Bahrain Watch, and we did a lot of, you know, campaigns and research projects, some of which were incorporated into the book. And a lot of this involves collaboration with fellow Bahrainis or activists, you know. So even within this, there's an element of kind of action research, of being part of an activist community. And again, I don't want to draw a distinction. I do think it's nebulous between activist and academic, and I think there is literature on that. And you know, so this was also part of the method, right? And there was overlap in those things. So I'll get back to that, but then I'll just go to the archives now. Is the archival research was primarily records from the India office, either in the form of edited volumes or going to the British Library in London, and also Kew, the National Archives, which has more of the archival stuff from the 1950s onwards. The India office is primarily before 1920s and 1920s to 1930s. There's bits and bobs everywhere, so you have to kind of go between. There was some, I think it was there was a British political agent, Dixon, and some of his archives, I think, were at St. Anthony's in Oxford, right? I can't remember. So there's a small archive there. But, you know, I think, you know, that a lot of the India office stuff is probably a bit more well worn. I didn't focus a lot on the legal documents that are available in the British Library that I think Statci has looked at, and Elham has looked at, another Bahraini scholar. You know, that's a fantastic resource, but in addition to the work I was doing, there was no way I had time to go into that level of depth, and maybe I missed a lot because of that. But you have to draw a line somewhere. But I think the stuff from the National Archives is probably where a lot of the originality in terms of the empirical. I mean, I like to think there's originality everywhere, because a lot of the empirical, it's a very highly empirical book, as Statci noted. But a lot of the post-independence material from the National Archives, I think, was relatively, it was sort of wasn't as well trodden, or not really well trodden at all. And there's a lot of stuff there. But there was even stuff in the National Archives that hadn't really been looked at. There was a fascinating incident of a British policeman turned whistleblower, Major Little, who, you know, left the Bahraini police and filed this big report about how corrupt the Bahraini police were. And then you had the British Parliament trying to, he went to British Parliament, and then the FCA were thinking, how can we shut this guy up? Shall we sue him? You know, so you had these kind of strange little stories that, you know, they sort of challenge the overarching trope of just, you know, British police versus, you know, working alongside the Al Khalifa. It was far more complex than that. And during the time, and this is where in a way historian versus activism came useful. You know, there was plenty of documents that were withheld in the National Archives. You know, I remember going through one portfolio involving Ian Henderson, aka who's known as the Butcher of Bahrain, and he's a very obviously controversial figure, because he was the one who put down the Mau, or helped put down the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya before coming to Bahrain, and so was very much seen as the archetypal brutal colonial officer. And you know, he was investigated by the London Metropolitan Police. They dropped the case, so he's very much kind of an understandable target from Bahraini activists. And I remember coming across a withheld document in one of the archives, and I thought, I knew from the previous page in this document that the withheld document was a conversation between Ian Henderson and an employee of the Bahrain embassy, the UK embassy in Bahrain. So I thought, I wonder what this document says. And so, for example, I filed freedom of information requests. These were then denied. I appealed. They were denied. I went to the Ombudsman, the Information Commission, who upheld the FCO's decision. Then I complained to them, and then they gave me like 2 sentences. And then we ended up taking it to court, myself and Bahrain Watch, in order to, you know, we went to a tribunal with 3 judges ruling on whether this one document, whether they could release more information from this one document. And bear in mind, this costs money, this takes time. And eventually we won the case technically, but winning the case meant getting like 5 sentences, if that, through this whole palaver, you know. So you're really up against the kind of the old colonial state, when you try to even get information that may implicate or may be controversial to Britain's allies in the Gulf. And the interesting thing about it is that the way they justified withholding this information was that it might damage Bahraini-British relationships, which is an incredibly vague and expansive way of trying to essentially prevent controversial information getting out. So that was another aspect of the historical research. It wasn't just sitting down to archive. Some of it involved, I mean, when you go to court, it's usually because you are pretty fastidious in looking through the documents in order to potentially find those useful gems or insights. So yeah, I mean, the documentation in terms of archival stuff was pretty wide-ranging. But I would certainly say the post-70s stuff was interesting, and there was lots of important work there, lots of information that challenges a lot of the dominant tropes you see written on the region, and this is particularly relevant to studies of things like sectarianism. I think one of the most fascinating things for me that came from this, looking at the decision-making processes within the Bahraini government, or at least the ones that you could get a hint of through the relationship of the British with the Bahrainis, was, for example, in the Iranian Revolution. If you look at the transatlantic, or the literature on the rise of the Shia crescent, it's often kind of attributed to the Iranian Revolution. And in Bahrain particularly, you could see this antipathy towards the Shia long preceded that. And I mean, one of my favorite examples from the book was you had the British ambassador going in to meet Sheikh Isa, the British ambassador Harold Walker at the time, and he actually went to see the Sheikh to see why there hadn't been so much support for the Ayatollah Khomeini. Right? He raised this, and the Sheikh gave his reasons, but it was this interesting moment where you sort of see this, like, oh right, so it wasn't like all Bahrainis rose up to support the Iranians, right? So you get these like important insights from looking at in detail these documentations that you don't necessarily get from higher level research, which is important in its own right. I'm not dismissing that. But if you just sort of look at the region and you don't go into detail, it's very easy to say, wow, there's a Shia community here, Iranian Revolution, there's obviously going to be a domino effect. So sorry, I know that's a bit off track, but I just want to emphasize again why it is important to revisit a lot of these archival sources, regardless of their provenance. Ideally, I would have loved to have seen communications from the Bahraini side, but there was no way in hell that was gonna happen. So you are limited by what you can look in terms of primary documentations about higher level decision making. It's unfortunate, but I would have loved to have looked at the other stuff. Yes, and colonialism.
Yeah, colonialism. So, just on that point, Mark, sorry.
Yeah.
One of the things I found fascinating with the book that I just finished was when I was looking at the 1920s and British engagement across the region. I spent a bit of time looking back over Gertrude Bell's diaries, and she was speaking in a very similar manner to the type of language we've become accustomed to with regard to the Shia crescent, and concern about loyalties to the Persians. And in the 1920s, this was in Iraq, concern that the Shia of the south would be far more loyal to Persia than to the nascent Iraqi state. And similar things cropped up in Bahrain as well, I believe, similar types of concerns, that lazy stereotype of Shia and Iran for slightly strange reasons at that point in Bahrain. But yeah, I just thought I'd flag up a similarity there to stress your point.
Yeah, I mean, again, this comes back to the, I'll come back to the colonial thing. I'll deal with some of the aspects of the sectarianism in a minute, but I think again this highlights the difficulties when we talk about sectarianism. I mean, there's very much a tendency, there's a tendency after 2011 to sort of be very dismissive of sectarianism in terms of, people who adhere to a sort of slightly more, I guess, leftist perspective. It was like, sectarianism doesn't matter. It's instrumentalized, it's the instrumentalization of sectarianism versus the sectarianism is an actual phenomenon worthy of study. But there is a middle ground, and sectarianism, the sect matters in many regards. But I think in the Bahraini case, what was so interesting is that, you had an example, right, of this, it was one night where 2,000 Bahana camped outside the British agency because they were protesting against the Al Khalifa attacks on them, which I think, Statci, you've documented in detail, the first and second Citra outrages. I say outrages because that was what the British referred to them as. I mean, they were massacres or whatever you want to call them. And you had a member of the Bahana community saying to the British, listen, you're legally, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but you're legally obligated to protect the ruling family of Bahrain, the Al Khalifa, right? So that means we can't do what normal people do who get oppressed in this region, go out to others for help, right? So you literally had a Bahana saying, listen, it's not like we're willy-nilly going to be like, deferential to the Persians. It's like, but if these guys keep repressing us and keep killing our people, then what do you expect us to do, right? And this is very interesting. And I think it was Major Daley, the British. He took this information back to the political resident in the Gulf and saying, I totally sympathize with that. Right? We're protecting the people who are harming them, and if they do anything back, we're legally bound to protect the people who are attacking them. It was a very strange situation, right? And at the same time, Persia were, threatening to take Britain to the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a relatively new entity, right? It was a very interesting beginning of an international kind of framework for moderating interstate disputes, right? So the British as well, I mean, the Persians were making the most of it. So they were, in some ways, acting as an antagonist, if you want to call it that, but they were also expressing concern for the Bahana, right? So there was an element that their actions and their threaten to kind of, protect their co-religionists was also one of the reasons why the British decided to take further action in terms of trying to control the Al Khalifa. So I think, there's so many forces at play that can accentuate those sectarian dimensions. But I think at the end of the day, if you have coexistence between entities and there is a form of equality between those communities, I think perhaps these communal differences aren't as acute. Doesn't mean they go away, but often when we talk about sectarianism is the manifestation of tensions into some form of articulation of difference, whether that's violent or otherwise, right? And I think the articulation of difference is less salient when you have a more harmonious coexistence for whatever reasons. But yes, and but I think it is interesting, and you can't just say sectarianism doesn't matter, or sectarianism is everything. It's a very dynamic and often fluid process, and that's why it's important to look at the external actors. There's so many variables going on that it's quite hard to determine what. But now I can talk about I want to talk about the British, the middle way, as I suppose, because this ties in again with the colonial thing. I mean, I think it was Britain's role in Bahrain is very interesting, and again, it's always very difficult when one writes about the region. I think now, especially with the salience of identity politics, there is a temptation to be very kind of polarized about it, right? It was a colonial project, or no, it wasn't. It was, pure sectarianism by the Al Khalifa. And even if you look at some historical theories about collaboration between, the colonial agents and the dominant regimes, the Al Khalifa regime, there is always an element of these attempts at collaboration. And it's always important as well not to deny agency to the actors involved in the country itself. I was very clear about that in the book. By overemphasizing colonial overrule, you are denying to an extent agency. That's not to deny that for a large part of the first half of the 20th century that the British were much more powerful in terms of its military capacity. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they always had the political will or the clout to do as they pleased in Bahrain, right? One of the reasons for the internal reform, and this ties in with the middle way, is that, and this is where I disagree, I think, with James Onley, or I used to. I mean, he sort of maintained that gunboat diplomacy wasn't so important after one important battle in the Gulf, but actually you saw that the British used to use the threat of gunboats to basically threaten the Al Khalifa, and they did on I think one or two occasions actually fire on some coastal installations in Bahrain. But they had these very clear discussions, like we don't have a standing navy in the Gulf. It takes time to get a gunboat to come up the Gulf and to do what we want it to do. And then you had the government of India basically saying, Bahrain is on the periphery of what we see as an important part of our empire for the most part. So what you need to do is try and get control through indirect and pacific means. And that's the term that they use, indirect and pacific means, which was basically, without using pure military might, try and sort things out. And this is where you start to see things like the development of the civil list. You know, the British essentially sort of essentially controlling the means of wealth distribution, because one of the reasons why the Bahrain used to get attacked, which is one of the reasons why conflict was generated, was because the Al Khalifa used to arbitrarily extract wealth from them whenever they got in debt. So basically they said they kind of slightly deposed Isa, who was the ruler, put in his place Hamid, who was more malleable to British rule, and say, listen, if Hamid's the one who gives you your money, you know, you had like this speech by Knox, who was very, very kind of Orientalist, your traditional Orientalist, sort of, you know, like lecturing the Al Khalifa, saying you have to do the job of, the ruler has two jobs, you know, to punish and reward. It was like basically very old school IR theory. And he essentially was threatening the Al Khalifa. He was like, if you step out of line, you're not getting money, you're getting cut off. And they made this very clear to Hamid. And this was basically a reflection of the fact that they couldn't, or weren't resourced enough, or that the government of India was unwilling to dedicate so much violent military coercion onto the Bahrain question, right? So a lot of the methods that were adapted by this were a result of that. And this in a way is the middle way, so to speak, because the middle way was one that wasn't purely coercive, and it wasn't purely complete administrative control of the state. You know, I mean, and I say complete administrative control because what that means is that would suggest, you know, less autocratic, but it doesn't actually mean that. I mean, you have a very good example of someone like Charles Belgrave, who is probably known by many people listening here, but for those who aren't, he's a British former military officer who came to Bahrain, I think 25, the early 20s, I don't remember the exact date, stayed there until 1956. He wrote a diary every day, or most days for that period, right? Which again is a rich source of insights. But at the same time, he was simultaneously financial advisor for the ruler. He was at one time the commandant of the police. He was the advisor, right? So the fact is that he was doing all these jobs, partly because, you know, it was deemed that, well, this guy is clearly competent, but partly because, again, the government of India were unwilling to resource so much of what was going on to Bahrain. So by default, you created this kind of autocratic system where there was so much power invested in one man, simply because, you know, they weren't doing the classic kind of colonial, let's use the military force and have a standing army. Even and I'm sure the police is an interesting thing, but, you know, the presence of the police was also very contentious in this regard. You know, they didn't use certain policemen, I mean, for a number of reasons, but they got rid of the original police force that had been drafted in from, I think, the Punjab, because they were too expensive and they didn't speak Arabic, right? You know, they thought, well, they don't speak Arabic, so the local population aren't going to respect them, but also they're too expensive. So we need to start training a local police force. And then the local police force, that was also political, because the Al Khalifa didn't want the Persians in the police. The Bahana didn't necessarily want the former, you know, henchmen of the Al Khalifa in the police. So again, you've got this compromise. So a lot of these kind of solutions, they are acts of repression, because at the end of the day, they are all attempts to try and curtail the power or the influence of a certain group, social movement, if you want to call it that. I mean, you know, that's a bit of a nebulous kind of definition, but these are all elements of that. And so the middle way, it's not that it challenges colonial overall, it's just merely to say that colonialism or imperialism in many ways is still imperialism, but there isn't one type of imperialism. You know, imperialism itself is a very broad conceptual umbrella. And at the end of the day, you know, you can't deny that the ultimate military authority in Bahrain was always going to be the British until independence. There was no doubt about that. But the nature of the rule and the nature of their influence was such that there was always these possibilities for negotiation, undermining. I mean, the whole 1920s to 1970s characterized by these kind of small feuds between various actors. You know, so you can't say that it's like a police state where the British had complete authority. It just didn't work like that. And, you know, there's plenty of interesting examples of how this played out. But also, I think it's important as well to sort of talk about how attempts to ameliorate dissent through various types of administrative reform had knock-on effects tens of years later, hundreds of years later. I mean, I think one of the most poignant examples to me is when the British were trying to, again, curtail one of the reasons that created conflict amongst the Al Khalifa, which was the gifting of land, right? So it was very common for Al Khalifa to gift their allies and members of their family pieces of land. But the problem is this was done often they'd gift the same piece of land to one person or someone else, or they'd gift land to someone and there was Bahrain living on this land or someone else, and that would create arguments between people who thought they owned the land and between the Al Khalifa, right? So of course the British what they did in lots of their kind of colonial states, which was to create a land registry, do a cadastral survey, and to basically attempt to define who owned what land. Okay, and so, to some that might seem innocuous, but this really is like fascinating. There's there's quotes from British officials saying, all right, we've had the cadastral survey, we're doing this because we want to try and ameliorate the tensions in Bahrain. However, we're acknowledging that most of the land has been filched or stolen from the original Bahrainis, I think was what he said, right? But this is the best we can do now, right? And it's kind of like they tried to create the solution, a short-term solution to a problem that would then have knock-on effects, because as you know, one of the drivers of unrest for the past 30 years has been issues related to land ownership, housing, the accrual of wealth from landowners, landlords whose land has gone up in value and who then become landlord classes charging tenants down the line, right? So really what this did was entrench the power relations, or it entrenched the Al Khalifa's conquest of Bahrain in a legal form through land ownership, which in itself fascinating, because the intent there, mainly from the British, with their template of how to fix the state, from the imperial experience, was we're going to solve the short-term problem by creating a land registry. Yeah, tens of years later, it's created. So this middle way, this attempt to create, let's say social or political solutions without violence, was very much a method that led to violence later on, or led to tensions later on. So when I say middle way, it's almost like in some cases it's kind of deferring, it's sort of deferring the consequences of one's actions for short-term gain. And I think that's another interesting example of Bahrain. It goes to show, there wasn't always some grand master plan to what was being had. Often it was ad hoc. It was reactionary. Often a lot of problems that had been spotted before were left to fester. And then they, erupted in conflict, and then they created a reactionary solution that was a band-aid, and that would later have these kind of huge effects. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think with the colonialism thing, we have to be, it's an interesting case, because I think there's very good arguments to say that Bahrain is a settler colonial state, but that the colonizers are the Al Khalifa. And so what does this mean in terms of British colonialism? Because the British assisted them in solidifying their rule, just as they, the British have also been a crucial part in, for example, the establishment of the State of Israel, but it's generally accepted that the State of Israel is a settler colonial state, right? And Bahrain is obviously a different case. I'm not saying it's the same, but you have very similar elements of that, in which you have a ruling class who dominated the instruments of state. They've, through the media and the institution they created, they have created discourses of demonization of a indigenous class, so there's all these elements to suggest that the Al Khalifa maybe deserved that mantle also of being a colonizer, and the British maybe the imperial force. But I don't want to make a clear distinction between the two, if that makes sense.
Statci, do you have anything to add on this point in response to Marc's observations? I'm thinking this with you as a criminologist in particular.
Well, I wanted to just speak to the last thing he said about the Al Khalifa being potentially the original colonizers, so to speak. And I think that that's very apt. And I think that that is potentially where I was heading in my own book when I took a historical sociological approach and said that the major historical disruptions that we're dealing with in terms of current sectarian order is the Al Khalifa conquest, and then the British administrative takeover, as I call it, in the 1920s, right? And that these are the two big moments that sort of set up the structures and create the kind of conflict that's going to ripple out. And so I think you're really onto something here, that maybe we can go further with that original conquest and really look at it as settler colonialism. And I think sometimes we don't do that because we think of settler colonialism as a white imperial action. Absolutely. And so the idea that an Arab tribe from the center of the peninsula would also be settler colonialisms is provocative and important, because it actually usurps our sort of notions of what that looks like culturally, and or where it can originate from, and so I love that. I think that we need to take that further and see where that goes. So that's awesome. Yeah, in terms of the chronological type stuff, the only other question that I had or was interested in hearing more about was the Bahrain court that you mentioned, that didn't have sort of a solid sort of legal code that it was operating with until the 1950s. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, because simultaneously in the political agents courts, they were using the Indian Penal Code, and that may be fair or unfair depending on, it's an imported code, but it was at least consistently applied. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to whether in the Bahrain court led by Belgrave and the Al Khalifa sheikhs that got put on the court, was it purely, arbitrary, or did they piecemeal law from other places? What was the nature of the lack of law exactly, if you know? I mean, I don't know if the records say that, but I was really curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons I would have loved to, again, delved into the cases, because for some, I mean, you've probably experienced the same when you look at the history of anywhere, but Bahrain in particular, is that sometimes you'll get an insight, or sometimes you'll get something that seems to contradict the thing you read. And you're sort of like, well, how would, you'd like to be a fly on the wall, I suppose, like every historian, and say, actually, how did this play out? And I found for me, some of the most useful resource for that was Belgrave's diaries, because, sometimes he writes about his court cases, like sat on the court today, played tennis, and sometimes you go into detail. And I think, from when Belgrave sat on courts, it was certainly the case that, there was elements of Indian penal code that was used. But I mean, again, I didn't focus on the day-to-day, and I focused, with the nature of, for example, the political trial. I think it was an interesting example of when Belgrave was on one particular case that really highlighted, again, this proximity between law and power and politics, and this was the notion, I can't remember, it's Nonick and Selzner, the notion of repressive law, which I talked about, which is where there is very little distance between those two things. And it was the case where, Hamid, there was an attempted assassination on Hamid, who was the ruler of Bahrain. He wasn't hit. But I think the most interesting thing is that the initial suspect was Sheikh Abdullah. And Sheikh Abdullah, as a notorious, for those who are unfamiliar, Sheikh Abdullah was one of the main reasons the British sought to intervene in the 1920s. Major Daly created this list of all these abuses he was reported to have conducted, from abduction, kidnap, sexual assault, rape, all these things. He was very much, the kind of a malign figure. But at the same time, and this again goes back to the middle course, the British saw him as the most competent and intelligent Al Khalifa. That's how they phrased it, right? So he was this liability in terms of what he did, but also an asset. And so when they were looking at this attempted assassination of Hamid, they were like, we're pretty sure it's Abdullah, because Abdullah and Hamid had this massive tension, because Abdullah basically led the faction of the Al Khalifa who wanted to reinstall Isa, who had been deposed by the British. There's some contentious arguments there, that Abdullah represented this kind of nascent, anti-imperial force, which I think is really problematic, because Abdullah was really a very, if the records are to be believed, which I have no reason to doubt, that he was a violent and pretty awful person who was very self-interested. And then Belgrave was like, oh yeah, we think it's Abdullah. And then suddenly does this about face. He's like, oh, we think it's Abdullah. However, because he's competent, essentially, maybe he should be one of the judges on the court that seeks to try the people involved in the case. So essentially, Abdullah became a judge on the court in which he had initially been the prime suspect. And this was all Belgrave's kind of like, Belgrave's sort of plotting. And because he's like, I think Belgrave said about Abdullah, I think he's clever enough to be able to implicate the man. And then sort of this was used to get rid of another problematic sheikh, Khalid, who had also been involved, I think, in the Sitra outrages. And so, Belgrave kind of used one enemy, put him on a court to get rid of another, but Abdullah really took the place, because one, if they got rid of Abdullah or tried him, they would have been impossible, I think, to control his faction of the Al Khalifa, but also because he was seen as competent, right? And then Abdullah became Minister of Education. He was one of the judges who then extradited, the 3 Bahrainis in 1956 to St. Helena. So this guy who had really been the kind of focus of all the grievances of the 1920s essentially became a very much an established figure responsible for dishing out justice. And I think this really highlights one of the issues we've seen with the legal system in Bahrain between the 1920s and 1950s. It's that it was very much the situation where it was neither about legal knowledge nor competence that made someone a judge or judicial figure for the most part. It was simply power and control. And I think that was the dominant thing. So I think we can't dismiss the importance of penal codes and whatnot. But when it came down to serious political cases, law was always usurped in favor of political expediency or political necessity. And I think, there's no rule, there's no rule of law, there was rule by law being the same. And I think that, so, the emergence of repressive law was very much an element of the 1920s to 50s. It would actually be very interesting to see the nature of the cases or the nature of the types of case and the nature of the sentencing, because, you could probably compare to see if there was differences in sentencing and that kind of thing. But yeah, I politically, I think, law was subsumed to politics. I think I use Kirchheimer's classic political justice to sort of frame a lot of the types of trials we've seen in Bahrain. Because again, going back to the notion of, and this is not unique to Bahrain, and a lot of, and I think this is, what Statci was also saying is that, there's plenty of good theoretical frameworks that can be applied to Bahrain cases that give refreshing insights or new insights, like whether it's settler colonialism or just conflict criminology, or or repression in this case. And I think, this shows, like the notion of the political trial is not unique to Bahrain, but you see every time there's some form of social disturbance in Bahrain, often it culminates with this political trial. We saw the trials of some of the Al Khalifa in the 1920s, which we never really saw ever again. And then we saw the 1956 uprising basically culminated not just with the arrest of leaders, but with their trial and deportation to St. Helena. We saw a similar thing in the 60s, and then in the 70s we had the trial of the Popular Front, and was accused of killing Al-Madani, a newspaper editor. We saw the same in the 90s. In 2011, we saw the Bahrain 13, the way they were framed. So these are platforms to stigmatize basically the perceived perpetrators. Even in 1920, Belgrade was very much clear in asserting that the trial of these sheikhs will give the idea that justice has been done to Bahrainis, right? So it was a way of like trying to draw a line under the past and moving on forward. And I think what's interesting in, like in Fuad Khoury's excellent book on Bahrain, obviously it's a fantastic book, but he does say one thing that I disagree with. And he said that the trial of the Khawalid sheikhs, the Al Khalifa sheikhs in the 20s, marked the beginning, or the success rather, of like, private law, of arbitrary tribal rule. Actually, I don't think that's true at all. Because one, the people sentenced in that just came back to Bahrain and actually lived in the house of the guy they tried to assassinate. So that was one thing. But also it belies the fact that actually justice never stopped being arbitrary. And so we can't say that there was a line drawn under that in terms of a new epoch in terms of legal repression or political justice, rather.
Mark, I'm conscious that we are rapidly going through our time.
Oh wow, yeah, of course.
And whilst it's fascinating, we're still in the 1920s and 30s, and we could keep talking about this all day, I'm sure. But I want to take a slightly bigger picture, if I may. Before we get to the Q&A, I'll ask people to just put questions in the Q&A if they have any. One of the things that I found fascinating concerns your engagement with the Al Khalifa and their agency, their sovereign power, and the extent to which they have agency. And you're very clear in your conclusions that it's easy to dismiss those claims to agency. And reading the book, it's easy to see why one might reach that conclusion, that Al Khalifa agency is easily dismissed. Given the importance of the British, the Saudis, etc., etc. But what I found fascinating was the ways in which you document the Al Khalifa trying to exert agency in the face of these broader geopolitical forces, playing off the Saudis against the Iranians, for example.
Right.
So I wonder, both in the 1920s and 30s, but also more recently, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that, please, in terms of Al Khalifa agency in the face of all of these, in some ways, parabolic pressures.
Yeah, I mean, I think, pardon me, I never talk this much, not in lockdown, but yeah, I think firstly, when we look at agency, we need to be clear that there are obviously levels of agency. You know, to what extent does, for example, any person have agency within a system of structures that moderate their control? So I think there's levels of agency, I mean, spectrum, if you will, and that's not to deny, you know, the fact that the Al Khalifa very much had suzerains, but their expressions of agency, I think, came in terms of their ability to attempt to negotiate, for example, more of the civil list, or for example, to exclude post-independence the role of the British in the police, you know. And I think when you look at if they look at their history from the 1920s, they would have seen a lot of whilst they often valued, or some of them valued, the protection that the British gave, it wasn't the same for all Al Khalifas. So post 1971, for example, when the current Prime Minister Khalifa bin Salman became very influenced in the Interior Ministry, his desire to get rid of the British in the police, for example, shows an expression, I think, of agency in terms of his reaction to the British. It doesn't mean he wasn't deferential then to Saudi, which was certainly the British perspective, but he's, I still think, enacting some form of agency in a process such as that. So I think the way agency manifests itself is very much contingent, because for someone like, potentially someone like Khalifa, he might see his relationship with the Saudis as not necessarily an act of subjugation or being deferential to the Saudis, but more as an alliance based on common interests. Right. So when we talk about agents in that regard, I think there's an element, if we're talking about counter agency, of the suppression of people's ability to do things that they might want to do. So I think when it comes to that, I think post 1971, some of the ruling family, and especially Khalifa bin Salman, I think actually wanted to align with the Saudis in some ways, and I think that became very clear. So I think there was a release from the shackles that some of these people felt when the British were, the suzerains. So I think that's kind of important too. And these things played out in very different ways. It's very often agency becomes important, or an important topic of discussion, when we often take certain figures and overemphasize perhaps their power. And I think there's much tendency in the media and academia to do this. I mean, currently people talk about MBS all the time in Saudi, Mohammed bin Salman, as being kind of omnipotent. I'm not denying his power, but there's always more complexity to it. And I think, like another good example in Bahrain was when, and this again is bizarre because it ties in with the notions of sectarianism or provoking sectarianism, is a shura in, I think it was 1981, so 2 years after the Iranian Revolution, a shura had passed off peacefully, right? There'd been, no obvious signs of dissent, right? And Ian Henderson, again, much maligned as the architect of all repression in Bahrain. It's not to say he wasn't an awful person involved in the various things, but he wasn't the person removing everyone else's agency as the omnipotent kind of interlocutor in Bahraini politics. He goes to the emir, or he goes to the British saying, oh, there was no problems. However, the fact that there was no problems prompted Khalifa to start deporting Bahrainis. Oh, sorry, arresting Bahrainis in this case. He arrested 650 Shia, right? And he's saying, this is just going to antagonize the situation. This is going to provoke sectarian unrest, right? So what you have here is an example where, the Bahrain Minister of Interior, Khalifa bin Salman, is like, doesn't matter what you say anymore, mate. We're doing our own thing. So it wasn't just this kind of British police controlling the Al Khalifa. And I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize with this notion of agency, is that, there was scope for members of the ruling family to do what they wanted to do, whether that was in, I think sometimes there were instances where Saudi said, do this, do that. But I think there was plenty of instances where the Al Khalifa were doing things that they would have also done regardless of what the Saudis said, and going against the advice of their former imperial overlords. So I think that's, one of the examples of agency. And you see that post 1971, and it was very clear in the security services. There was a line in 1973 where Jim Bell, who was the head of police, and Ian Henderson, who was the head of the CID, basically they used to have regular meetings with the Ministry of the Interior, and that stopped. So So you're seeing a distancing between those two agencies, a division of labor between often what the British were doing and what the Al Khalifa were doing. And I think that's quite striking, because it shows that, again, this Al Khalifa state within a state type thing is detaching itself from their former overlords and reconfiguring in another way. So I think it's just important to bear that in mind, because there's a tendency to essentialize the actions of agents, whether it's the British, the Saudis, one person in the police, when actually, as people who do history, we know that nuance is always essential, and it's very hard to make broad causal generalizations or broad arguments about what variables were the most salient in any kind of given situation.
Statci, do you want to add anything on that before we perhaps go to our Q&A?
I was just really interested, not having focused in the sort of period after the 1940s. Ian Henderson, I think your approach to Ian Henderson was also really important, because I think that he has been completely vilified, certainly by the British press when it comes up, and I had no nuance about him. And so I was actually really surprised that there were occasions where he may have intervened in certain events as a factor of restraint. And I was just wondering if that was also surprising for you, and sort of how would you characterize him? I mean, clearly he's still also very much a part of the repression.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about his legacy and what he means. I mean,
that's one of the very difficult aspects of this book, because I'm trying as much as I can to try and let the facts speak for themselves. And there's clear examples. I think there was an ITV documentary where you have a Bahrain who claims that he was digitally raped by Ian Henderson. Obviously appalling, and no one's trying to diminish that role. But at the same time, you still can't ignore the facts. There were instances where he did, again, and I say modulate the nature of repression. He encouraged or attempted to encourage the ruling family from taking certain courses of action that I think were far more egregious in those cases. Obviously, there's stuff we might not know about the nature of its influence, but I'm saying in terms of, at the moment, I would say in terms of knowing exactly what it was he was doing, it was at times complicated. And I think he's vilified partly because he definitely deserves it to some extent. But at the same time, he was always an acceptable target of vilification, whether it was from the Al Khalifa or otherwise, because the Al Khalifa, as we know, and this is an important thing, was they always attempted to appeal to notions of, say, Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism to an extent. But you couldn't criticize them directly. So you could criticize Ian Henderson. That was kind of not off limits. He was an acceptable thing. So criticizing Ian Henderson was very much allowed. Had Bahrainis been allowed to criticize the Al Khalifa, maybe the criticism of Henderson would have been drowned out by that. So he becomes a lightning rod for these things. Not that he wasn't part of the apparatus, but he becomes a lightning rod at the expense of the others who also were very much key agents in the repression of Bahrainis. And I think that's important to note. And it was difficult for me because, at the same time, like he's been called the butcher of Bahrain for a reason. And I mean, the press thing is interesting because, again, I took another court case, freedom of information stuff, about the actual evidence that the Metropolitan Police had gathered and given to the Crown Prosecution Service, is the body that decides whether to launch a case. And they said they had 10 boxes of evidence still. And I said, well, can I see it? And I won't get into the ridiculous Kafka-esque kind of conversation that followed, but I was never able to access that kind of information. And it's, it still could be ongoing. But I think the Ian Henderson thing is one. I mean, there was also, for example, I think it was the late 70s or early 80s, Khalifa had ordered deportation of Bahrainis, Bahraini citizens specifically, to Iran. And this is something that's not known much about. I mean, Amnesty have documented that there were these deportations, but no one has really kind of, done any research on what actually happened. I think a lot of these people came back, but he comes in to complain saying the security services, like, quote unquote, acting on behalf of the current king and Khalifa bin Salman, are deporting Bahraini citizens. And he's like, this is ridiculous. This is just going to create an insurgency abroad, and that's going to have security consequences in Bahrain. So sometimes, often it wasn't necessarily out of benevolence. It was about a pragmatism in terms of Bahrain security. But he was still saying what is happening is also absurd. And I'm just documenting what I saw as his role in this. hopefully fairly. But you know, I'm sure not everyone's going to be satisfied with that. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe other stuff will come to light that show he was the eminence Greece. That it's possible.
Well, it actually makes a lot of sense when you were saying that it's easier for folks and maybe safer for folks to criticize Ian Henderson than it would be a member of the Al Khalifa family itself. I mean, in terms of personal safety and comfort and political repression within. And so I think that makes a lot of sense that there might be, though he is by no means a positive figure, right? I mean, I agree.
Yeah, exactly.
But that there was even an exaggeration of that because it was he was a safe target for folks. And so I mean, think about that. That makes a lot of sense to me.
But so, I mean, you may have seen this when you did work on, you know, especially coming to the 50s, Stacey. I mean, what was very interesting about 1956 in Bahrain, we see this playing both sides as well. When you had members of the Committee of National Union who were obviously, you know, campaigning for a number of things, but mostly like legal reform and a parliament, they would go to the Al Khalifa, and the Khalifa was saying, the British don't let us do anything. But at the same time, you had the Al Khalifa going to the British going, when are you going to crack down on this movement? You know, they're threatening our power, right? So they were like pretending to be like, oh, we can't do anything, you know, because the British. But actually, there's also evidence to suggest that, you know, some of the provocations that resulted in the crackdown of the National Union were instigated by members of the Al Khalifa family. I mean, again, it's not clear, but this was speculated on by the British that there was some evidence to suggest that was the case in order to necessitate the British involvement to clear the Committee of National Union off the streets. So this kind of utilization of the British scapegoat has been very much an aspect, I would say, of Al Khalifa hegemony.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm conscious we are rapidly running out of time. So can I suggest that we turn to our Q&A? We've had a couple of questions in, but those of you that are still with us, do send in any other questions. We'll start with Jassim, who is in Bahrain at present, and he's sent in two questions, one for Mark and one for you, Stacey. Mark, first, do you think there were missed opportunities for locals to do away with sectarian divisions prior to independence, like during Nasser's era in Egypt? And Stacey, have you noticed serious attempts by the authorities to streamline and strengthen the legal system?
Okay. Do you want me to go first?
Please, Mark. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think yes and no. So the Committee of National Union in the 50s was very much, it was positioned around this idea that they wanted to try and do away with sectarian differences and have a form of, or at least a political body that would embrace differences. However, I mean, I can't speak to the nuances of that because it's always easy to say that with idealism that this is what they wanted. However, there were very much clear attempts to provoke that or disrupt that unity, right? So there was very much good-natured attempts by Bahrainis to do that. However, that was not desired by the authorities. Again, it's this classic divide and rule. One of the classic examples was when the CNU ordered a strike, the British went to the Persian merchants and sort of say, hey, Persian merchants, since lots of you are merchants in Persian, this is going to be bad for business. And so they encouraged them to set up their own group who like countered the strike. So it was like already, you know, the British had created a situation actually where they sort of made the Persians the enemy of the CNU in this context, right? Which had a knock-on effects in terms of exaggerating sectarian differences. However, at the same time, there was other institutionalized forms of sectarianism outside the role of the sort of this grassroots movement that were also making it hard for people to actually overcome these sectarian differences. When 8 people were killed in 56, they were shot, and then I think 4 killed in 1954. One of the things that the independent investigation and Belgrave noted about this is that, I mean, he said the police are Sunni and that often they feel more entitled to be violent against the Shia, right? And he said, sadly, that's the way it is, right? So he was making the case for that the means of the monopoly of violence was mostly in the hand of one sect. And purely by virtue of that, it meant that they had the power to kill the opposition, in this case, who were Shia. So the fact that the police were weighted in this way and had the monopoly of violence also provoked these sectarian divisions that, you know, so there was so much force operating against the desire of people to actually end these divisions that I think it was very much beyond the control of civil society or whatever you want to call it to actually try and remedy that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but one of the essence of any rule, it's not just imperial rule, it's divide and rule, right? And that's exactly what was happening.
Stacey.
Yeah, in terms of the streamlining question, I'm not sure what time period exactly the questioner is getting at, but I will mention that since the 2011 uprisings, we are seeing a lot more sort of mass trials, so citizenship being revoked with dozens of people at the same time, which is highly repressive and being much more utilized in my view than in the past, those kinds of mass legal procedure. So that's certainly a streamlining that I would have my eye on as being particularly problematic and repressive. And I think just as a general comment, I think that Marc's one of his overall observations in this book, that things are sort of getting worse from the point of view of political repression is correct. We're seeing a lot more politicization. You know, it ebbs and flows, right? But we're in a high political moment, I would say, in the last few years, and certainly since the uprising, where, you know, a lot of these criminal trials are actually, you know, not about what they purport to be, right? The charges may be one thing, but there's certainly political and identity, group identity, collective punishment stuff going on. The seizure of Daraz was a really important part of your book, where an entire village is, you know, basically incapacitated from daily life, you know, because of it being alleged to be this hotbed of disinactivity. Right. So I think there is streamlining, and because of the nature of you know, the lack of transparency, and we end up having to look at this through journalism and open sources and informants and human rights groups, that we're getting pieces of it. But I do feel, yeah, streamline is a great way of looking at it, and not for the good, right? Efficiency, not for the, you know, at the expense of justice and human rights.
But that links into the other question with regard to the revocation of nationality. And the question from Nasser Edain is along the lines of why the international community is relatively silent and passive with regards to this denationalization policies. And I guess there's a broader dimension to this, which is, I guess, right at the heart of the book, Marc, this balancing of the different levels of analysis, if you want to put it in an IR sense, but also the engagement with different actors locally, regionally, internationally, the ability to position actions within all these different sets of interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think often this kind of questioning comes from this, it's a normative position of Bahrain as a sovereign state versus the international community as two entities that have not converging interests, but I think there's a tendency sometimes to overestimate the power of, say, the UN. I mean, international community is a broad tool, but I think one of the arguments I make in the book that is key is that, you know, in some ways, obviously the state matters, but we have to be less state-centric when we talk about the role of and the nature of repression, right? Because the role of repression in Bahrain is the cumulative actions of not just the Al Khalifa, but multiple agents in a supply chain of repression, whether that's legal cover from the British overrule, Saudi overrule, US based in Bahrain, US policy, for example, in containing Iran, you know, British companies, PR otherwise, selling surveillance equipment to the regime, training the police. These are all elements of it. I mean, I think, I can't remember who talked, they did like a kind of different take. They were looking at protests, but they looked at the, you know, the transnational protests, right? The policing of transnational protests. But one of the arguments I make here is that there's much transnational repression of what's happening in Bahrain. Yeah, there are good people out there, and there is good institutions, international institutions, trying to shed light on the repression in Bahrain and trying to pressure governments or international institutions to take action. There's also plenty of more, I would say, dominant actors in this case who are trying to execute their own foreign policy interests in Bahrain, which at this time are very much at the expense of people who want democratic change, right? Because the argument has very much remained unchanged in Bahrain, regardless of who was Suzerain, Saudi, British. The reason that the British didn't decide to support the overthrow of the Al Khalifa in 1956 was because they knew the Al Khalifa gave them a military base in Bahrain, right, in the time of the Cold War. It was a known, right? If they had a democracy, that would become unknown. Currently, you know, the Al Khalifa support British interests in the Gulf still, and the same with U.S. policy, etc. Right? So these things, unfortunately, tend to trump the interests of people wanting democratic change, and it's not always that straightforward. I mean, certainly under Obama, the the reason the authorities hated Obama is because he was a bit bigger on human rights, and that made a difference. I mean, it did make a difference, and there's no doubt about it. When Trump was elected, we had more people killed in Bahrain than had been killed in the past 5 years. We had 3 people executed. We had people shot on a boat, essentially because they knew that they could do that because Trump wouldn't kick up a fuss, and they were right. Right. So the sad reality is that a lot of the international actors who have influence in the world just want the status quo to continue. And they want it to continue in a way that reflects as well as possible on them, but they still want it to continue.
Well, what a deeply depressing point.
I know. Ah, geez. Yeah,
but alas, it's hard to disagree. I think we've just about reached the end of our time. And so all I would like to do now is just say a huge thank you to you, Marc, for, first of all, writing the book. It is a wonderful tome, something that has benefited me a great deal. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it, if you can enjoy reading such a thing, but I've enjoyed reading it and got a lot out of it as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for giving us your time today to talk with us and engage with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. Obviously,
thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Statci, as well. It's been great to hear your reflections. It's been really, really wonderful. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us and for your questions. We'll get a recording of this put up online in the next couple of days, so others can catch up on it. And until then, thank you very much. Stay safe. Take care of yourselves.